So just quickly introduce myself. My name is Fiona Shaw. I'm part of the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities team here at Education Scotland, and I work mainly in the Forth Valley and West Lothian region. You can see lots of people here today from the area, so that's great. I have a secondary science background in chemistry and physics, and I'm joined today by my colleagues who will be helping out with the chat and with the slides and to help answer any questions that you have. So just wanted to give a quick overview of the webinar today, and just ask, once I've gone through this, for you to think about what your expectations are for the session. You don't need to share these, this is just more for you. So obviously the first thing, just quickly, we'll be running through some protocols. I'm going to be providing a brief introduction to what our team does. Some of you might already be familiar with that. And then explore why it's important to challenge gender stereotypes. When does stereotyping begin? Examining unconscious bias, what it is and the effect it can have, and the impact on children and young people. A bit of time for reflection and some sort of more practical strategies around making changes, finishing with a plenary, and the webinar is due to end at 5:30. So up on the screen here, I've got the contact details. We've got our Twitter, so if you are on Twitter, feel free to at us with anything from the webinar, any thoughts. And also I've put the square try this with learners or try this with colleagues that might be popping up throughout the webinar. So I'm going to turn my camera off now. Feel free to leave yours on, but please make sure that everybody is muted when you're not speaking. And this will prevent any background noise or interference. If you do wish to feed in, please indicate this by typing the word speak into the chat pane to draw the attention of my colleague. We've got quite a big group today, so that's probably the best way to do it. You can also use the chat pane to post a resource link or to make a comment for others in the meeting to see. And of course, if you lose connection, please don't panic and just come back in following the instructions in the email that you received. Also, throughout the webinar, I will be leaving deliberate pauses to allow you to read or process what I'm saying. In case people worry they've lost connection, I will be pausing regularly to respond to comments and questions, so please feel free to post throughout. In addition, most of the webinar will be me talking, but there are some interactive bits where we may ask you to reflect or take part in activities. And for some of those, you'll need a pen and paper, or equally, you could just type it. So please make sure you have something available so that you can take part in those. Again, I just wanted to let you know the webinar is being recorded so we can upload it for those who've been unable to attend. And please don't let that put you off contributing. So I just wanted to start by outlining the aims of the programme, but also to make links with the importance of continuing to focus on this throughout recovery year. The Improving Gender Balance and Equalities programme works with school clusters to explore and assess interventions to address gender imbalances in participation, curricular preferences, learner pathways at every stage. And this is largely because children receive and absorb gender stereotype messages about what they can and can't do as a girl or as a boy from a very early age. And so challenging gender stereotypes and addressing unconscious bias is important so as not to place limitations on young people. Research also strongly suggests that there is no inherent difference between girls and boys which should limit their interests, capabilities, or ambitions. And yet we recognise that subject choice and many subsequent work and life choices are highly gendered. Our approach is a whole establishment one, tackling the root causes of gender imbalances in a sustained and embedded way. And whilst this year there may be many competing priorities, we hope that small actions can be taken and built on to lead to whole school approaches, whole establishment approaches. The overarching aim, which is why it's kind of separated from the others, is around improving gender balance in subject uptake and learner pathways. There are inherent barriers to all young people accessing the same opportunities. And while young people should not be coerced into making any particular decisions, adopting the attitude that young people are able to choose whatever they want for themselves will not counteract the problem. In this recovery year in particular, we have already seen how distancing and cleaning of equipment has limited opportunities for children and young people, for example, in STEM subjects. And this will have a gendered impact, as figures show girls are already in a minority for a number of STEM subjects. I also just wanted to say that we refer to girls and boys throughout this in order to highlight gender stereotypes and to be able to dismantle them. But we do know and appreciate that gender isn't binary and very much exists on a spectrum. Also, just a reminder for people that have just arrived, we are recording the webinar, but please don't let that stop you from contributing. I also quickly wanted to highlight how it ties in with national priorities. So firstly, STEM. Central to the STEM strategy is an ambition to close persistent gender and other equity gaps in participation and attainment of STEM. In terms of DYW, the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities programme feeds directly into the milestones, the equalities milestones. And this year will present big challenges in terms of post-16 destinations and outcomes due to the limitations on work-based learning opportunities, employer engagement, colleges and universities. And that focus on making all pathways available for all young people in the best way possible is important. In terms of health and well-being, gender stereotypes shape perception, behaviours and attitudes, and gender thinking influences what we expect and accept in ourselves and in others. So breaking down gender stereotypes and supporting equality will contribute to young people's emotional well-being, physical safety, sense of inclusion and resilience. And this year we've seen a spike in mental health concerns, particularly relating to anxiety. And this again will have a gendered effect. Girls more likely to experience anxiety and boys potentially unable to voice their mental well-being concerns due to those accepted social norms. So being aware of these differences is going to be essential to provide the appropriate tailored support. A big one as well is raising attainment, and for some centres, their starting point for tackling gender-related factors impacting the poverty-related attainment gap, and others engage in response to under-attainment of boys. So focus work around the self-efficacy gap amongst learners also has an impact on attainment, particularly in relation to maths and science. And these gaps do exist in all areas, but are particularly visible in literacy and numeracy data. Again, particularly for this year, the focus is on those who are experiencing poverty, numbers of which will have increased, and understanding gender differences in attainment will be an important factor, again, in providing that targeted support. What's also important to not lose sight is that these experiences cannot be considered in isolation, and poverty, gender, ethnicity, disability, etc. will all need to be considered when planning interventions. For example, as we know, Black and minority ethnic young people and their families have been disproportionately affected by COVID, so there will be implications here. And due to gendered expectations, it's possible that girls might have been expected to do more housework or chores than boys, and therefore had less time for studying. And each of these feeds into the other and will have implications for the attainment gap. And finally, each of everything that I've spoken about there can be addressed through learning and teaching. So I'm just putting up a couple of word clouds here. This activity is quite a good one to do with young people and with colleagues, and it's simply asking them to enter or to think about 3 words associated with boys and 3 words associated with girls. It is a potentially leading question, but actually, as you can see from the word clouds that are on the screen here, and despite doing it with people of all ages, of all backgrounds, you usually get similar results. And I think you can see very clear patterns. It's probably quite obvious which one is for girls, the words for girls, and which one are the words for boys. And those of you that have used kind of word clouds before will know that the bigger the word, the more times it was mentioned. So what's interesting here is there are lots more words in the boys one, as well as obviously the words themselves. So there's more variety. And there's also more words stereotypically associated with science. For the girls' word cloud, more creative, emotive, compliant, and a lot more to do with appearance. And boys, there's very limited emotive words that are in the word cloud there. And the stereotypes that we see here, although we know they exist, we don't necessarily subscribe to them, but that doesn't stop them having an effect. And stereotypes essentially create very rigid boxes into which young people feel that they have to fit. So they're both descriptive and prescriptive. And both describe how boys and girls supposedly are, but they also dictate what's expected of them and what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. Not only that, but it also amplifies the differences between genders and it forces us to notice those differences more clearly, leading us to believe they're innate and inherent. But of course, we all know that these are very much stereotypes. It doesn't stop us knowing the words in the first place, nor does it stop them from having an effect. And in general, the effect happens unconsciously, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And the fact that unconscious bias can develop through exposure to these stereotypes. And they're pervasive and they're very ingrained in our culture. So on this slide, there's obviously quite a lot of differences between the words, and it's almost showing there are differences between boys and girls, but actually research paints quite a different picture. So John Hattie's research demonstrates there is more variance within groups of girls and boys, and groups of boys than between them. And actually, these differences should not be of a major concern. But gender stereotypes create gender roles to which people feel they have to conform. And what's important to remember is that these ideas we have about how boys should behave and how girls should behave are inaccurate. As I mentioned previously, gender is very much a spectrum and is socially constructed, and they tell us how we should act and what it means to be each gender. And those ideas are intrinsically linked to this idea about biology being the same as gender, the idea of a boy's brain and a girl's brain being quite different, and that these differences are natural. However, new techniques that allow us to examine the brains of newborns as they perform tasks actually seem to show a fairly consistent message. At birth, no sex differences were found. So modern neuroscience suggests the relationship between the brain and the world is very much two-way traffic, and the environment we're exposed to has a vital role in creating those gender differences that we see. And its socialization is what leads to any perceived differences between genders. And that leads us on to another piece of research that examines the difference in academic performance, which again demonstrate the plasticity of the brain. Next slide, please. Thank you. Any differences we see in performance are actually likely to be due to the stereotype itself impacting something called self-efficacy. You might be familiar with that term already, but self-efficacy is essentially the belief we have we can achieve something or overcome a challenge. And the stereotype, for example, that girls are worse at maths then impacts girls' confidence, and they're less likely to believe they are good at maths. And this can then impact their performance in the subject. So that evidence that suggests that those gaps in academic performance are not determined by innate differences. So why is it important to tackle gender stereotyping and address unconscious bias? Well, this quote says clearly that they can lead to inherent barriers for young people, and they continue to make choices which conform to gender stereotypes, which might limit long-term career opportunities. So despite it laying out a clear link between stereotyping and career choice, we also know that gender stereotypes and unconscious bias can have profound effects on mental health too, important to consider in the current situation. And furthermore, gender stereotyping is linked to violence against women, sadly something we have seen rise during lockdown. So there are myriad reasons in terms of education and society why challenging stereotypes is important. Also important to consider that any effects on stereotyping will be amplified when children and young people experience barriers related to other characteristics and or poverty. Whilst what we discuss focuses only on the principles of unconscious stereotyping can be applied to other intersecting characteristics such as poverty, race, age, etc. With that said, there is a significant impact on choice, and that starts from a very early age. And by the time they're in high school, these ideas are fairly cemented. So I'm just displaying a graph here which shows, oh, I'm getting some feedback. I think someone's got their mic. Thank you. Just displaying a graph here that shows the gender balance in uptake of STEM hires. And it shows the percentage of entries that are male over the last 30 years. So it goes right back to 1986 up till last year. So if you look at the graph, the orange line and the green line show biology and human biology down at the bottom. That's about 30% male, and therefore 70% female. And sitting around 50-50 are chemistry and maths. And whilst they present as equal, there are often gender differences in why young people choose these subjects. Boys tend to choose it because they enjoy it, they think they're good at it. Girls because they need for a further qualification or job. And what's striking about this graph is that there is very little change in numbers over the last 30 years, despite many interventions. But if you look carefully, there is the beginning of a downward trend in males taking STEM qualifications just towards the end of the graph there, which suggests the balance might be changing. And this isn't just, I've chosen STEM subjects, but this isn't just seen in STEM subjects, but across the school. So lower numbers of boys taking what's deemed as creative subjects, arts and languages, and a similar pattern is also found in apprenticeships and other vocational pathways. So this graph displays the future intentions of young people. This is secondary age pupils S1 to S6, and it's from 2016, so a few years ago now, but this is what pupils themselves say about their career paths. And I think if you think back to the word clouds that I put up before, it probably reflects quite well the kind of the stereotypical assumptions. There are clear gender differences here. So boys more likely to want to go into the higher paid STEM careers, the sports or armed forces. So you can see much higher percentages of male. Sorry, I should say the male is the orange bar and the female is the blue bar. And the girls are more likely to want to go into something more creative, like care or hair and beauty. And you can recognise immediately there's actually a clear pay disparity as well. Not enough to encourage the girls to go into the higher paid STEM careers, but actually important to think about what we're doing to show the value of female dominated sectors. ELC in primary obviously being one of those as well, and to highlight and encourage and celebrate skill development related to these pathways with boys. And when you ask younger children, the results are quite similar. The ideas about what girls and boys can and cannot do become fixed from a very early age. And in fact, from birth, children are given messages about how to behave and expectations around this. So despite babies being unlikely to remember these cards, the gender differences in them may be indicative of how girls and boys are treated differently from birth. Gender reveal parties, the current trend, also being a perfect example of this before they are even born. So I'd like you to just take a moment to look at the cards and almost play a little game of spot the difference. What are the major differences in the cards? And is there a legitimate reason why they need to be different? So I'll just pause for a second to let you have a quick look at that. And feel free to, as I said previously, post anything into the chat box, any observations as we're going along. But I think, what jumps out certainly for me is that the girl card shows a baby being cuddled and the boy card shows a baby being swung in the air. And actually, that's backed up by research. So research does show that babies are played with differently according to their gender. Adults tend to use more language and read more with baby girls, but indulge in more rough and tumble play with equivalent age boys. And the images that you're seeing on screen here, if you're primary or early years, you're probably familiar with it, but it's from the book Guess How Much I Love You. And both images are actually father and son. So the card company have decided to gender the images, and it's just, I suppose, another example of how very young children are treated differently and potentially pushed towards certain toys or certain activities, and then those different expectations, so different things expected of them. And this is actually articulated and shown really well in a documentary called No More Boys and Girls. And there's a great clip actually showing how adults inadvertently direct children to different toys, and essentially meaning they develop different skills. I'm not going to play the video today because of technology, but my colleague has already posted the link to this short clip, so please watch it in your own time. So another huge example, apart from toys and clothes and cards, is books, a huge example of huge influence for children. And in 2017, there was an in-depth analysis done of children's picture books. So it was 100 most popular books. And what it revealed was that male characters were twice as likely to take leading roles in children's picture books and were given far more speaking parts than females. In terms of the characters themselves, males were typically embodied as powerful, wild, dangerous beasts such as dragons, bears, and tigers, whilst females tended to be portrayed as smaller and more vulnerable creatures like birds and rats and cats and insects. And then, also shockingly, female characters were missing from a fifth of the books ranked. And I suppose a lot of these messages that are provided to children are unconscious and are often quite unwittingly done. And they're both reinforced inside educational settings and outside them. So I can just see there's a comment in the chat pane. Thank you, Bethany. So fascinating that there's even a value placed on celebrating the gender. The congratulations should be a focus rather than celebrating that the baby's a girl or a boy. Yeah, definitely. And I suppose it's thinking about, the card companies did make that decision to gender it, and thinking about the hype and the excitement around gender reveal parties and those aspects. I suppose from their point of view, they're trying to make money. So, but certainly celebrating the life of a newborn child definitely makes more sense. So the next slide is actually a little activity, and this is where you might want to grab a pen and paper, and it's a little story. I'm going to allow you just to read through it and try and remember as much about the story as possible, because on the next slide I'm going to ask you some questions about the story. So I'll just pause so that you can read through that. And this one is actually quite a good one to try as well with if you've maybe got older children or with colleagues. So I'm going to pop up the questions, and obviously you've not got that table in front of you, but if you can just jot down the numbers 1 to 11, and then for each question you can shorten it to TF or DK for don't know. And again, I'll just pause to let you do that. So thinking back to the story and answering the questions. Also, yeah, feel free to share them. I can see some people have typed that in the chat pane as well. So definitely share what you're thinking as well. That'd be great. Thank you. Got a few more answers coming in here now, so thank you for that. So obviously we are a very primed audience today on the webinar, and the fact the webinar is called Challenging Gender Stereotypes and Addressing Unconscious Bias, but a lot of you are sort of saying not sure, it wasn't specified, no genders were mentioned in the passage, and don't know for all of them. So if we can just flip back to the story and have another read again. And, you know, all of us probably will have had a picture in our head when we read that for the first time. I certainly did. So the way I picture it is the builder is a sort of middle-aged white man, balding for some reason. He's shouting to a nurse who's a young woman, and she's wearing that kind of traditional nurse outfit from Call the Midwife or something, which is obviously not what nurses wear these days. The same nurse arrives at work. Senior doctor, because it's senior, was a man in my head. The children the older one was the son and in the army. The younger one was the daughter and a beauty therapist. And then the doctor divorced a woman and is currently dating another woman. I was also imagining they were all white, all able-bodied, and probably all of us, I had a sort of an idea about their socioeconomic class within that as well. And I suppose, in answering those questions, what we've all done is almost mitigated for that unconscious bias a little bit. We've paused and reflected and gone, actually, my brain's trying to make assumptions there about people's gender and about people's race, but actually there wasn't any information. And I can see some comments coming in here as well. So thinking that it was either female or male, yeah, but reading, actually, when you think about it, it's uncertain. And then there's somebody else who's used something like this with S2. Yeah, so a girl for the nurse, a boy for the doctor, gender wasn't mentioned. Yeah. So it's really interesting, that point, actually, because it crops up, it doesn't have to be about gender, but the topic crops up often. And I think using those points to explore it a little bit more with young people and see what their views are and where their views come from is really interesting. And I think what it really highlights is that we all have unconscious bias, and it's essentially our mind's way of identifying patterns. So it helps to process information, and it's shaped by our exposure to representation and stereotypes. So if the majority of nurses I see, everyday life, in adverts, in the media, are female, then when I don't have enough information and a nurse is mentioned, all I can picture is a woman. But interestingly, when people imagine the non-stereotypical gender in that role, it's usually because they know somebody who does that job. For example, a man who is a nurse. And that really highlights the importance of representation, I think. You can't be what you can't see idea. And this is a good one to try, as I said previously, with learners and with colleagues. So our unconscious mind is quite useful at finding patterns and filling in gaps and making sense of the world. And it's our natural instinct. It's basically how we categorize people, and it's based heavily on assumptions that we make. Essentially, we develop it due to the influence of the world around us, and it is created by heavy social influence. It's not intentional, it's very habitual. And what's important to remember is that everybody has it. And whilst we can't get rid of it, there are ways we can try and mitigate it. The first of these is by trying to be aware. So I suppose what we all did just there with the story and the questions, stopping and thinking and actually going, was that obvious, or was that just an assumption I was making? And the more you do that, I think the more you can recognize when a thought is being influenced by unconscious bias. And these thoughts will enter your head automatically as a result of years of social conditioning from the media, from your own educational experiences, the way history is presented. But what's important, I think, is that we recognize that bias and pause, stop and think and examine why. And this applies to our practice too, as it can have implications for children and young people. So I'm just going to talk now a little bit about the impact of stereotyping and bias on learners. And it can be subtle, yet quite significant. So two of the areas that you see on the slide here, feedback and interactions, and these biases are evident in these two areas. So in terms of feedback, teachers, I'm just going to break down this table a little bit. Teachers tend to be more likely to compliment boys on their work to make up for reprimanding their behaviour. So boys receive a lot more negative feedback, but it does tend to be behaviour focused. Girls receive less negative feedback in general, so the criticism tends to be focused on ability. And this impacts girls' confidence and sends boys the message that they can succeed even when their behaviour isn't great. And thinking back to my classroom, I was certainly guilty of this. So thinking about a group of boys who maybe weren't settling, finally when they did, sort of praising them for sitting and writing the date and trying the first question, that's fantastic, well done. There'd maybe be a group of quiet girls who'd answered a few questions, and then I might go over and say, okay, well, this one's correct, this one's not quite right, here's what you could do to improve it. So it's not obvious, but it's quite distinctively different feedback. And similarly, when giving a test back, might say to boys, did you not revise enough? Did you not work hard enough for the test? Or to girls, it would be something like, was there something you didn't understand? So for the boys, it's about their effort, and for the girls, it's about their understanding. And so it's subtle, but quite distinctively different types of feedback. Interestingly, from that research, where all children were given the sort of feedback most often given to girls, they actually all tended to lose confidence in their academic abilities. And if you look at the right hand of the slide, in terms of interactions, this data actually comes from our pilot project, but I've seen this pattern repeated in many classrooms. Essentially, green represents boys on the chart and blue represents girls. And the top one, which shows the number in the class, that proportion should be replicated throughout if interactions are equal. So as you can see, the majority of voices that are being heard are boys, and the majority of teacher time and attention actually focuses on boys. And I think even where practitioners feel like they are giving that equal time, actually focus groups with students and classroom observations have shown that what's shown here is representative and does tend to be representative. Obviously, that's not going to be every single case, but it's interesting to reflect on that. And each of these examples reflect a huge societal issue, stereotypes that impact confidence, choice, and engagement. But we can also make small changes to make learning environments more inclusive. For example, we have an interactions monitoring template, which you could ask a colleague or a pupil to use to monitor where your time goes. And this can act as a useful baseline to sort of target interventions regarding interactions. And I mentioned before about it starting at birth and having that kind of long-term impact, but it might mean that certain choices feel off limits to young people. And this arises from a complex interaction of self-identity, of confidence, and of skills developed. Thinking back to the documentary I mentioned, when children are pushed towards certain toys or treated a different way from birth, they are developing different skill sets. And so as educators, we can influence this positively and help to remove some of the limitations that stereotypes and bias can place on children and young people. So I'm just going to put some quotes up on the screen. These are some quotes from secondary pupils, and I think they begin to illuminate some of the ways we can make changes to practice. So I'll just give you a minute to read through them. And I think what this highlights for me is asking young people themselves where they think is a good place to start. Can be really useful. So you might be aware about the United Nations Convention of the Rights of a Child as being incorporated into law in Scotland, and essentially it ensures that children's rights are respected and protected. And any practices that work towards challenging gender stereotypes and addressing unconscious bias link explicitly to the right to an identity, which is Article 8, the right to freedom of expression, which is Article 13, the right to be listened to and taken seriously, Article 12, and perhaps the most explicit link, the right to an education, which develops their personality, respect for others' rights, and the environment, which is Article 29. And using the UNCRC as a vehicle could be another way to explore these issues. So, what are some of the changes we can make? An important part of the process, as we found with the unconscious bias activity, is around reflection and practice. And these are a few examples of things you might wish to consider as a starting point. And again, if this is triggering any thoughts of things you've seen or done or tried, then please do share your thoughts and experiences either by speaking or in the chat pane. And just to expand on these a little bit while you're thinking, I'll give a couple of examples of each. Pet names. So sweetie, love, buddy, pal, champ. Generally used more for girls than boys. And I think being aware of these and whether or not they reinforce stereotypes is really important. Seating plans. So I suppose thinking about the motivations behind the seating plan. Does it play up to imagined or socially conforming stereotypes? Does it reinforce them? Again, thinking back to when I was in the classroom, I would be using them as behaviour tools, spreading the boys out as far as possible and then interspersing them with girls. But actually, on reflection, that might have been reinforcing the expectation that their behaviour can only be good if it's tamed by sitting next to a girl. Errands. So boys to carry things. You know, can I have a couple of boys, strong boys to carry this? Can I have a couple of trustworthy girls to go to the office, etc. And it might not be as explicit as this, but I suppose it's just trying to reflect on who is being chosen to do these things and whether it is reinforcing stereotypes. And lastly, behaviour. So do your expectations differ by gender? So do boys get disciplined more harshly? When you look at the exclusion rates, actually there's evidence that boys make up, I think it's an average of 75% all exclusions. And there's a potential for this to be escalated more quickly. And coupled with that, the kind of boys will be boys attitude. So I suppose it's just reflecting on whether expectations differ in that sense. So is there anybody who's got any experiences or thoughts that you might want to share on those topics? Please feel free to do that. And I've just spotted in the comments there, so thank you to my colleague Hannah for posting the references. Her growth Dweck, so Carol Dweck, yeah, most of you I think will be familiar with her work and her growth mindset theory. I think it might be worth mentioning that that relationship between kind of growth mindset and girls' risk aversion. So I mentioned previously in one of the first couple of slides around the academic gaps in academic performance not being determined by innate differences, but actually girls tend to avoid risks. So not having had previous opportunities to explore and fail, and the kind of safety of that going forwards, I think, could be something that's feeding into that. Okay, so any thoughts on the last slide around pet names or behaviour, errands, etc.? Okay, we'll maybe just move on to the next one. So other areas that might be worth considering, where you might be seeing gender imbalance playing out in your setting. Again, please feel free to share any reflections on these topics. And delving into some of the areas I've spoken about already, thinking about interactions that you might have with learners, and again, the research that we showed, do particular groups or individuals take up more of your time? And could that be because of gendered expectations? Does the environment show diverse posters? For example, thinking about tray labels, posters of people doing different jobs, did that reinforce stereotypes? And obviously I mentioned earlier that representation matters, as it's difficult to be what you can't see. And this, of course, will apply to other protected characteristics such as race and disability and sexuality, as well as things like non-traditional family makeup and socioeconomic status. So having displays that have that diverse range of people doing diverse things is one way to make your environment more inclusive. And does the curriculum have broad appeal to all learners? So couple of things, is it football themed to attract boys, or is makeup being used as a context to make girls feel included? And there is research shows young people can actually find that patronizing. So I think reviewing the curriculum through that equalities lens can be a good first step as well. And then at a whole school level, thinking about pupil voice, which we touched on before, uniform policies or anti-bullying, for example, the way sexist language or behaviour is challenged, and behaviour policies and timetabling, options, subject choice guidance and process, and just thinking, are any of these things placing limits on the choices young people can make? So thinking about column choices in secondary schools can often mean that young people make gendered choices as they're required to choose one subject or another to make it fit. So I can see quite a few comments have come in. Thank you very much. Dance and parkour opportunities over the years, but not so much in terms of boys doing dance. Yeah, I think it's interesting. One thing I suppose we haven't really spoken about is the policing that happens amongst groups of boys, and girls as well. That kind of, making fun out of people, or the stigma that might be attached. You can't do this, you're a boy, or you can't do this, you're a girl. And actually, that policing can have quite a strong influence, and that peer influence. And I think that, coupled with the perception of masculinity as being more acceptable, so it might be more acceptable for girls to do that kind of parkour side of things, rather than the boys doing the dance. And yeah, another comment about, in many settings, the onus is on girls to engage more with traditionally male activities. So taking part in sports or STEM, certainly there has been a big push on this in the past. And when you look at, as I posted earlier, the spread across the school, it is a whole school issue. And I think you know, what we're talking about, tackling the root cause around gender stereotypes and unconscious bias, is one strand, but there certainly does need to be that representation and that feeling that young people do belong in those areas as well. And the value placed on certain fields, yeah, and I think I touched on that as well in the graphs. And those higher paid jobs do tend to be valued more by society, and I suppose it's the same with the kind of arts that you're talking about there as well. No, I'm just looking at the time. Thank you very much for your comments. I'm seeing a last one there about early years as well. Girls are often complimented and praised for their looks and clothes, and boys for their attributes, brave and strong. Yeah, and actually I've seen that coming out in research as well. So thank you for sharing that one. And I suppose it's just, yeah, being conscious of that and thinking about it, the impact that could have long term. So thank you very much for your comments. Those of you who are in early years might be familiar with this image. This is taken from the Being Me, Realising the Ambition documentation, and it's also a really important one for what we're talking about. So just before we talk about some more practical things, I just want to leave you with this image. So if someone is oppressed or faces barriers, it's obviously important to make reasonable adjustments to provide the same opportunities. And again, just to pause for a second, just to let you have a look at the three images and what you think's happening in each of these. So the first image, I think, is just demonstrating that some are in a better position to access than others. So referring back again to the research I spoke about, boys might have that kind of higher self-confidence, particularly in numeracy, and that might be more aligned therefore with their self-identity to pursue that pathway compared to girls. And the second image, or again, you could flip that as well, thinking about some of the discussions we've had. And the second image shows that providing the same amount of resources or the same treatment seems fair, but actually not everyone can access the apples. And, you know, using the same line as the previous example, providing all learners with an opportunity to come to a club to learn about careers or to experience that particular subject or topic. But actually, if the majority of people who come to the club are boys, then girls might again believe it's not for them. So it's providing all with an opportunity, so treating everyone fairly, but not necessarily meaning that everyone's accessing it. And then the third image shows that ultimately we need to acknowledge different learners will need different levels of support to access different opportunities. And again, there might be extra, using the previous example, there might be extra activities that girls need to build their confidence in low risk environments so that they can start to believe STEM is for them, and creating a situation where everybody has a taster rather than leaving it up to self-selection. And again, you could flip this and apply it to boys. And I think some of the comments have touched on this as well, but I think it's important in the research. This is obviously not going to be every boy and every girl. And as I said at the beginning, we do use that terminology just because that's how the research tends to be presented. And essentially it's up to that sort of individual focus and really thinking about that learner as an individual. So moving on then to a couple of strategies that you might want to try. There's a lot of stuff on here, and as I said, we are recording the webinar, so we can certainly send you this and any points captured afterwards. This is a summary of things you might want to try. So something that you can try out and something that is learner-led or learner-focused. And I think this is really just to reflect the multi-pronged approach required to address this. There are other strands, such as engaging with parents, but for now I've kind of kept it quite simple. And I think the important thing to remember is just to try something and see how it goes. So from experience, people worry about getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing. But actually, if it happens, harness it and use saying the wrong thing as a discussion point. And hopefully making these small changes will eventually lead to learners feeling that they can engage in whatever they want to, their activity, pathway, behaviour, without feeling limited by gender stereotypes. So the last point on this slide mentions action guides and case studies. And we have a wealth of resources that can support with these ideas and other things I've mentioned on our National Improvement Hub page. The link is written up there, and there are practical action guides which might be a good starting point, specific to early years, to primary and to secondary. My colleagues just posted the link in the chat there for you as well. As we're nearing the end, I just wanted to alert you to our other professional learning events. Again, my colleague Hannah will post the link to the Sway, which contains live updates, plus the links to Eventbrite. So all of the other sessions except the outdoor learning will be more conversational and have fewer people. And I'm just hoping that this session has acted as that kind of stimulus to engage in further conversation, and hope to see you at some of these events to continue that conversation. So as I said, all of those details can be found on the Sway link that my colleagues posted. And at the start, I asked you to think about your expectations. Can I just ask you to revisit those in your head and see if the session has met your expectations? And if not, please use this time to raise any questions that you have. Just notice the time there's not much left, but I'm happy to stay on and take those questions. And if there were any links or resources posted, please don't forget to copy those. We also will be collating any useful links to send out to you. We do have a feedback form. My colleague, again, will share the link with you. Would be very grateful if you could take 2 minutes to complete this, as it will help inform any future sessions. As I said at the beginning, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to share your thoughts, and don't forget to at us at EdScott-IGBE. And please feel free to carry on the conversation on Microsoft Teams. So if you have a login for Teams for Glow, we've set up a network on there, and the join-in code is written on the screen, 8x8sfth. And lastly, but most importantly, thank you so much for coming along and taking part today. It's been really great to hear your thoughts in the chat pane, and your contributions for the unconscious bias activity. And we hope you found it useful. And if you do have any further questions, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you again, and have a good evening.